So thank you, Jonathan. I think, at least at the start of my talk, I'm going to be hopping back over those bridges of Jonathan's back into the ivory tower, but we will start walking out from that about a third of the way through the talk. I just want to start by repeating what Jonathan said at the start of his talk. It's a great honour to be here. It's wonderful to honour Baroness Onora O'Neill and to do so in the name of Ludwig Holberg. Many thanks to our hosts as well, to the Holberg Committee and all the work they've done. Okay, I'm just wondering how do I change slides when I need to? Do I just press this? I assume I do. We'll see. Anyway, Onora O'Neill's work has defined many fields: Kantian scholarship, political philosophy, most recently a focus on the ethics for communication. And I just want to start by pausing briefly on the first book of hers that I engaged with closely. This is her 1996 book, Towards Justice and Virtue. And in this book, she defends principles rejecting injury and indifference to others, on the basis that principles that allow injury or indifference can't be universally followed and adopted by everyone together. And to put it roughly, her idea is this: it's that reasons and principles guiding action must be able to be grasped and followed by all of us. A principle that some people could not possibly adopt could not be a genuine ethical principle. And now an injured or an abandoned person couldn't adopt principles permitting their own injury or abandonment. If you've been severely injured, you can't adopt principles at all. So if we want principles that all people could adopt, we need to reject injury and indifference. And from this start, O'Neill goes on to derive a wide-ranging ethical theory in which duty plays a central role. Now, several themes from this and her earlier books resonate in her recent work on communication and media ethics, and I'm going to return to them. Beforehand, a brief word about my own research. This is focused on the idea of rights. Unlike O'Neill, I see some attractions in what's sometimes called a teleological view of rights. In particular, I'm attracted to the view that if there are any natural or moral rights, where this means rights that exist independently of law or social convention, rights that exist whether or not anyone's spotted that they exist, then these are going to be rights that exist because they serve the right holder's interests, needs, or freedoms. That's my view. And on this basis, I think we can defend individual rights to freedom of expression and communication as something like natural rights, justified by the way in which expression and communication are important for the individual right holder, independently of whether this serves the wider public good. But we should note that this approach draws a very sharp distinction between the communicative rights of individual persons and the communicative rights of media organizations or other corporations. And this is because the interests or needs of artificial entities, things like Microsoft or the Times, say, these have no moral importance as such. They deserve respect only insofar as this serves individual persons. So if Microsoft collapses, that's only a problem if it damages people. Whereas if you collapse, it's a problem independently of whether anyone else is damaged. It's a problem in itself. Your interests are themselves morally important. So on my view, artificial entities' rights of communication should be treated very differently to the rights of individuals. Now, in her recent books and articles, O'Neill highlights the limitations of the right-based approach I've just outlined. And much of O'Neill's work here seeks to broaden our conception of the goods that expression or communication secure, so that we focus beyond goods to the expressor or communicator, and rather consider wider common goods and principles. And for O'Neill, democracy is one of the most important of these wider goods which duties and rights of communication should serve. And here she follows a tradition traceable from Aristotle to Mill. And I endorse this view that an ethics of communication must serve or instantiate the values of democracy, and that this is an essential complement to any right-holder-focused justification of the right to freedom of speech. This is where I find out whether this makes a difference. No? What do I press? Just next. There. Brilliant. Okay. There are only 2 slides. This is one of 2 coming slides, so don't expect fireworks, I'm afraid. Okay. In my contribution to this symposium, I'm going to examine 3 aspects of the democratic case for free speech. And I'll say more about them in relation to this slide. These aspects reflect 3 ways of defending democracy. First, many contemporary theorists highlight the instrumental value of democracy as a means of pooling the opinions of the diverse members of society who make up the electorate. It's sometimes called the epistemic defense of democracy, number 1 up there. It defends democracy on the ground that by letting everyone have a say in political decisions, democracy ensures that nobody's knowledge is excluded from our decision-making. A second popular view defends democracy on the basis that it's required by a moral principle of equal respect. That's number 2 up there. This view says, look, independently of the huge epistemic costs of excluding, think of historical exclusions, propertyless people or women, there's huge epistemic costs in excluding them. But independently of that, it's also just morally repugnant in itself to exclude these people. It violates the principle of equal respect. And we should note that this equality defense of democracy is often linked to the idea of self-determination. If I'm excluded from political decisions made by others, then laws imposed on me by these decisions will not be self-imposed by me, they'll be external impositions. Now, I believe both the epistemic and the equality defenses of democracy play a major role in O'Neill's work on the ethics of communication. They underpin some of her doubts about an unlimited right to freedom of expression. If rights of communication are importantly grounded by their epistemic role in helping people come to true beliefs, then duties to communicate intelligibly with one's trustworthiness clearly accessible, these will have a central place, and O'Neill stresses these. If rights of communication are grounded by their role in securing equality, then imbalances of power between communicators should be a concern, especially, I'd say, imbalances in favour of corporations. And O'Neill's recently put this in the following, this is a little quotation. She says, any adequate configuration of media speech rights has to take the realities of power and vulnerability seriously. Now, what I want to do in this talk is to think a little bit about what I'm now going to introduce as the third case for democracy, which I see as separate and complementary to the epistemic case and the equality principle. This is the idea of democracy as a form of joint or collective action. Democracy enables the state's actions to be our actions. And I believe that what the state does in a proper democracy should be our action, where we are all citizens, or perhaps all inhabitants of the state's territory. This idea of democratic state action as collective action is closely related both to the equality defense of democracy and to the ideal of self-determination, for which equality is necessary. So I think equality and collective action don't have to go together. You can imagine a highly fragmented society which secures formal equality of participation at the ballot box. But is that really genuinely joint action if it's so fragmented? You can also imagine a deeply hierarchical society that in some sense acts as one if every member believes in the hierarchical system. So even though I'd say sort of versions of joint action are possible without equality, in my view, an ideal of joint action requires equality. And so even though forms of self-determination by a group might be possible with formal equality that doesn't secure genuinely joint action, an ideal of self-determination by a group requires the group engage in joint action. So that's why I've got those funny arrows and things up there. The thought is, for the best form of equality delivers a form of joint action and vice versa. The best form of joint action requires equality. Together, that delivers an ideal of self-determination, or is necessary for the best form of self-determination. In addition, I'd like to claim that joint action is a good in itself. And this is a speculative point I'm not going to fully defend here, but I'd suggest that being part of a genuinely joint agent is an important good for each human. And this isn't just for psychological reasons about the importance of feelings of belonging. I'm tempted by the radical claim that often there's actually no metaphysical priority to individual action vis-à-vis joint action. So I think it's quite natural for us to think of a group's action as constituted by the action of the individuals who make it up. I want to suggest quite often it should be natural to think the other way around too, that my actions as an individual writing philosophy, cooking dinner, are constituted by the group actions within which they fall, group actions constituted, say, by a tradition of philosophical discussion. Now, I don't know whether that's correct. Even if it's not correct, though, it seems to me that an important case for democracy is that it constitutes state action as group action. This is a necessary condition for genuine self-determination. Only if democratic decisions are genuinely our decisions, rather than simply the decisions of a majority within a fragmented set of people, will the democracy govern legitimately. Well, my argument in the remainder of this talk will be that this collective action defense of democracy generates interestingly distinctive norms for communication and interestingly distinctive limits on rights to freedom of expression. And I'm going to suggest we can learn by attending more closely to these norms sourced in the conditions for collective action. So, my final slide, though we've got a lot of talk still to go. Let's dwell on some of the problems in contemporary political communication. Some of these are problems whose problematic nature can be explained fully by the epistemic and equality cases for democracy. The problematic nature of others, I argue, emerges only if we're committed to democracy as genuinely collective action. So here's my sort of personal selection of the problems. One is echo chambers. This is the phenomenon of people closing themselves off from chance encounters with dissenting views, focusing only on communications that reinforce what they already believe. And in Cass Sunstein's book, #Republic, his little quotation, he says, examining the behavior of 727 people over a 6-week period, R. Kelly Garrett found that people are significantly more likely to click on information that reinforces their views, somewhat less likely to expose themselves to information that contradicts these views. And I'm sure we've all found ourselves doing that ourselves. I remember hearing also that in the recent Brexit referendum in the UK, this is the electoral occasion, I believe, where you were least likely to know anyone who voted in a way that was different to the way you voted. An example of echo chambers in action. The second problem I want to pause on is adversarialism. So I think in much of the English-speaking world, it's assumed that the form of political debate should be adversarial. Media list winners and losers from budget decisions. Political interviewers take their task to be attack. I'll say something about the positive case for this in a moment, but it seems to me also to be a problem. Partly because it excludes the possibility that a view might fall somewhere between winning and losing. I think it's also a problem because it encourages a sort of insincere pose on the part of interviewers and interviewees, who will pretend to be adversaries, whatever their views. Third problem, spectacle or drama. So, as Guy Debord might stress, much political communication is presented as a show for viewers or readers to observe and perhaps consume, but not to participate in. This is as evident in newspapers as in visual media. So here are some examples. Business confidence, inflation rates, taxes. They're rarely reported simply as rising or falling or having been adjusted. Rather, they leap, or they get hiked, or they plummet, or they plunge. These changes don't just have effects, they hit or target particular groups. Politicians are held up to actors' standards of presentation. We have politicians accused of forgetting their lines or leaving their microphones on at the wrong time. And, I mean, to my mind, this presentation as spectacle makes any topic seem both more serious than it really is, because of the extreme language and the theatrical standards used, and in a different way makes it seem less serious by distancing it from the mundane and non-spectacular in which we live. Now, I sometimes think this is actually a personal problem of my own. I don't know if all the rest of you share it. I can't listen for long to any news interview because I find this sort of spectacularization just really turns me off. And I've been trying to work out why it is. I think it is this sense that it on the one hand makes it seem more serious and less serious. It's strange. The fourth problem up there, which I'll be very brief on because it seems so obvious to me, is market language. The view of the voter as a market consumer of a product purveyed by a political party. I think it's obviously pervasive. In the current UK general election, both party manifestos were described as the party's offer, as if we vote as consumers choosing which offer we're going to buy. As I often say, have you bought this policy? And I think that misrepresents what's going on. We together are choosing how we'll live together for the next 5 years. We're not buying a policy. Fifth problem, treating some people as parametric. Where parametric here means treating people as a parameter in the mathematical sense of a constant, something that's taken as unchanging. Now, this idea needs some explaining. And before I do so, I'll just point out it might actually seem like an odd point with which to end this list of communicative problems. You know, what about the fact that it's easy to disseminate falsehoods widely on the internet? The fact it's very hard to know what media source to trust? Well, these are important problems on which O'Neill has worked. We've heard Jonathan talk about some of them. But I think there's also something interesting to learn from this last problem. And I take the idea from a brief essay by Philip Pettit on the nature of consequentialism. There's a quotation here on your slide there. What he distinguishes between what I can justify in a context where other agents are treated as parametric, where this means as given aspects of nature with which I cannot expect to engage, and what I can justify in a context where other agents are treated as being on a par with me. Now, very often political discussions treat certain groups as immovable parameters in this way. We see this in the dismissal of certain groups as not worth arguing with. I think sometimes we see it in academic discussions in political science or theory, which focus in a detached way on a group as an object of study. I think the most pervasive treatment of others as parametric is simply the tendency to think of a group in the third person as them, rather than as members of some first personal us. So think about references by those in power to the people as them, who must be pacified. Maybe think about the controversy over François Hollande's reported reference to les sans-dents. Alternatively, think of references to the governing class as them, as the establishment or the man, an unavoidable power to be handled rather than reasoned with. Now, I think, as the example of the man shows, sometimes this parametric conception of some people is completely justified. It's the right way to think about them. If they really are an unavoidable external imposition on me, then in some sense I'm right to treat them as a given aspect of nature. Similarly, it might well be right, say, think about a tactical voter. For a tactical voter to give up on persuading her peers to vote for what she believes in, if you know that people aren't going to change, why should you continue to engage with them argumentatively as if you think you might be able to sway them? And yet I think media communications that engage in or encourage this way of thinking are problematic. Thinking of others in this way is in a certain sense solipsistic or objectifying. I was actually reminded of my fellow symposiast, Ray Langton, some of the work she's done on the objectification involved in pornographic speech. I think some things like that are going on, and I'm going to come back to that in a minute when you think of your interlocutors as parametric. Beforehand, though, I just want to step back for a minute. I'm going to come back to this. Recall my initial focus on how an ethics of communication might go beyond the good to the individual of their own freedom of expression. I said that O'Neill urges us to consider the wider public good of communication's role in a democracy, and recall the three justifications of democracy as a means for pooling our diverse knowledge, as instantiating a principle of equality, and as constituting a people as a joint agent, able to impose laws on itself. Well, if we think about these justifications in relation to the problems identified on the slide, I think we get some interesting results. So think about the epistemic defense of democracy. This is going to find problems in the top one, in echo chambers, just as it will with fake news or problems of trust. Anything that's going to damage electors' epistemic competence will be condemned by the epistemic defense of democracy. It's not clear to me, though, that the epistemic defense need find adversarialism, number 2, or the spectacle-like dramatization or market language, or indeed the treatment of some to be parametric. It's not clear that those are problems on the epistemic approach. In fact, we might be able to defend adversarialism and dramatization as ways of testing the robustness of particular beliefs. And if some people just aren't going to change their beliefs, it seems epistemically warranted to treat them as immovable parameters. So if we believe in that epistemic defense of democracy, I think we're sort of stuck, in my case at least, if I find all these things problematic, but it doesn't explain why they're all problematic. Only explains why the first one is. Similarly, the equality defense of democracy is going to find problems in echo chambers that reinforce power imbalances, as well as in market-driven inequalities in participatory power. And treating people as parameters who can't be influenced by reason, I think, is inconsistent with treating them as equal to oneself. But I'm less clear about why adversarialism or politics as spectacle or market language, why these have to be always inconsistent with the equality principle. And so my contrast, then, I suggest, is that the view of democracy as joint action can illuminate the problematic nature of all the problems I identified. So I'm trying to think, what do I not like about current media? Well, really, all of these are problematic because they stop or impede the idea of democracy as a joint action. Echo chambers and adversarial stances can't represent our fundamental relations to our fellows if we're to constitute a first-person, plural subject acting together. If an election is our choice for how to live together over the next 5 years, then, as I said before, I think the market view of it is highly distorting. Markets coordinate disparate individual decisions in pursuit of disparate goals without bringing the participants together as one group, making a shared choice. Similarly, I think the passivity created by dramatically presented spectacles of political debate is inconsistent with genuine joint action performed by a group that brings together both presenters and audience. So if you think about the norms of the theatre or the spectacle, they rule out the equal interaction required, say, if there's actually an accidental theatre fire and the actors and audience together have to work to put them out. When that happens, the drama on the stage has ceased. The norms that distinguish actors from audience have been extinguished. And with the norms in place, properly joint action of this type seems to me not to be fully possible. I find the problems of parametric thinking especially interesting. So think back to my opening remarks about O'Neill's book on book Towards Justice and Virtue. There she argues that any genuine principle of practical reasoning must in some sense be able to be grasped and followed by all of us. It must be a principle from which anyone could reason. This applies both to principles governing individual action and joint action. Now, when I treat someone as an immovable parameter, one of the things I might be doing is simply taking them to be immovable by reason at all, like a rock. And then I clearly can't be taking them to be part of a group of agents of whom I'm also a part, a group that can together engage in joint action. For action, as opposed to maybe the movement of the planets, has to be responsive to reason. An alternative way in which I can treat someone as parametric is for me to treat them as responsive to reason, but to not try to engage them by the very same reasons that move me. So here are some examples. If I ask for your assistance by drawing your attention to my own neediness or my own freedom, I thereby try to make the reason that motivates me, my need or freedom, my need for such and such, the same reason that will motivate you. I'm saying, I'm hoping that you will find my need something that motivates you to help me. If instead I compel your assistance by threatening to hit you unless you assist me, I thereby try to motivate you by a reason that's not my own motivation. My aim is that you be motivated by fear of being hit, and I'm not going to be motivated by fear of being hit. I'm motivated by my need or whatever it is, the thing that's got me to make this threat. So I'm trying to give you a reason that isn't my own reason. In the latter scenario, I think O'Neill's argument explains why what I've offered you is not a genuine ethical reason. For making your reason to act something I know is not going to be my reason, I'm not acting on a principle that can be grasped and acted on at once by both you and me. And I think we often decide to treat some group as parametric in this way, by lazily failing to attempt to engage the relevant party's reason with the same reasons that motivate us. Instead, we seek to motivate the relevant parties to our own ends, even good or worthwhile ends, through factors that we don't ourselves regard as our own reasons. And personally, I think there was a lot of this going on both sides in the campaigns in the UK referendum on the European Union. Think about the Leave campaign talked about concerns about the funds paid to the EU. That was one of their official main reasons for voting Leave. I'm rather suspicious of the thought that was the campaign manager's own reasons for voting Leave. Similarly, I'm not sure that the economic reasons offered by Remain campaigners really were their own reasons for their vote. And I think the unreciprocated nature of media communication is especially liable to create this unengaged attitude towards viewers and readers, this failure to offer one's own reasons to one's readers. So the kind of objectifying or parametric attitude I've just identified involves offering reasons to one's readers or viewers that aren't one's own in the hope of thereby affecting their action. I think this can't be properly joint action involving communicator and recipient acting as one. And I think it's related to what P.F. Strawson describes as the objective attitude, where there's a different view, but where you basically don't treat people as fully responsible or blameworthy. You see them as sort of objects of treatment. I think those two ideas are related, if perhaps distinct as well. Right, my arguments so far have been largely negative. I've suggested communications in echo chambers that dramatize, that use market language, that objectify or treat others as parametric. These are inconsistent with the joint action in which a democracy should consist. Are there any positive conclusions to draw about what media communication should look like in a proper joint action democracy? And how would these conclusions interact with the individual rights to freedom of expression with which I began? Well, we certainly shouldn't draw the conclusion that shared values are to be favoured independently of the content shared. I think requiring to share in this way might lead us towards fascism or other kinds of fundamentalism. And nor should we assume that any very concrete shared beliefs or values are necessary for joint action. This is actually something I want to think about more. My own hunch is that you can get joint action so long as you've got the right attitude between interactors without much by way of beliefs being shared. So what I would favour, for what it's worth, and this is just putting forward my own view as something that needs further work, is that appropriate communication of a respectful joint action form has at its heart the idea of address offered to someone conceived second personally as you, rather than as it, her, him, or them. Now, we don't all have to know each other personally to address each other in the second person as you. Think about how an author can address all her readers as you without knowing them. Think about those nice introductions to 19th century novels which start with "Dear Reader." I'm being addressed there as you by an author who died a long time ago. Now, in my view, I can't see someone as part of my group. I can't see them as someone with whom I could form a we involving something like joint intention or joint knowledge without seeing them second personally as you. I think this is necessary if I'm going to invite them to share my perspective in some sense. And I think that kind of invitation to share each other's perspective is essential to the kind of joint action in which the ideal of democracy requires us to live. Okay. I recognise that these remarks about second personal address need far more defence than I can offer here. so does how we should conceive the relations between joint knowledge, intention, and action. I basically put them down as a marker for further work, and I recognise that there are others whose work I could draw on here. Even if my particular claims about the second person seem unmotivated to you, I suggest my earlier negative points can still stand. The joint action case for democracy suggests we should try to abandon spectacular market and parametric thinking. And the free speech rights of media corporations shouldn't impede these changes to the norms of the public sphere, given that media corporations' role in enhancing democracy is the main ground for the existence of their rights. I think the weight of individual rights to freedom of expression, where this might include expression that does indeed spectacularize or treat others as parametric, I think is a trickier matter, again, for further work. But I guess my thought is once you start thinking about democracy as joint action, it forces you to think about these things. And in particular, I just want to point out something that I think Shauna Schifrin has stressed, which is the importance of communication as instrumental to good human thinking. I think when we turn to collective agency, collective action, communication is in some sense not just instrumental, it's constitutive of our thinking. Our collective debate just is our deliberation prior to collective action. And as such, the joint action case for democracy suggests we've got to get this collective debate right. We've got to strive for a public sphere that doesn't involve spectacular dramatization, market or parametric thinking. Okay, so my main suggestion then has been that a full diagnosis of problems with contemporary communication requires a focus not only on the epistemic inequality values of democracy, but also democracy as joint action. Now, O'Neill's groundbreaking work on the ethics of the media will, I'd hope, be complemented by a focus on the norms of communication required for people genuinely to come together in the first person plural jointly as we impose laws on ourselves. Now, there's a little bit more I want to say at the end, but just briefly before I get there, I mean, thinking of Jonathan's talk in relation to this, and I can imagine this will probably strike those of you who aren't philosophers very much as a philosopher's talk. You're thinking, wow, okay, he's told us we need to change these norms, we need to strive for this ideal of collective action. How on earth do we get there? He's even told us we can't get there by sort of manipulating people, by giving them reasons that aren't our own reasons. That's rather hard. And I think we'll see in some of the later talks we're getting, such as the talk we're about to hear in a minute, we'll hear other people talking about important changes. Laura, I know, is going to talk about important changes to cultural norms. What should we do to achieve those changes? Is, I think, a really important question that I haven't answered. I'm pleased with Jonathan's thought there might be reasons why that change is going to happen. But what our own role should be, I don't know. As a philosopher, my inclination is to say we should all just continue to engage in argument. That'd be the most respectful way to do it. Continue to engage in argument with everyone as much as we can. That involves treating others in this genuinely joint action way as second personal addressees who together can be brought to share the reasons that motivate the interlocutors. So I want to end by noting that Onora O'Neill's own public participation in her work for the House of Lords or the Equality and Human Rights Commission, for example, this I see as an example of this going on. She puts her own theoretical commitments into practice. She shows exactly the virtues of engagement, sincerity, and thereby commitment to genuinely joint action that I've argued for in this talk. And I'm so pleased that philosophy includes people like Onora O'Neill working in it, because I think it gives us an example of what we should all be striving for. So, thank you.